The Fairmont Grand was the most prestigious hotel in Boston, and my mother-in-law never let me forget that I didn't belong there. Margaret Sterling, the Queen of Hospitality as the society pages called her, had built her empire from a single inherited hotel into a chain of 15 luxury properties, and she hated that her precious son Andrew had married someone like me. From a farm, of all places, she'd mutter whenever I walked into a room. Probably doesn't know the difference between Egyptian cotton and polyester blend. If only she knew I put myself through Cornell's hotel management school by working 3 jobs. If only she knew about the business degree gathering dust while I tried to prove myself worthy of the Sterling name. But Margaret didn't care about degrees or experience. She cared about bloodlines and social connections. The Fairmont Grand has hosted presidents and royalty, she reminded me daily. We can't have someone with rural sensibilities representing us. So instead of the management position I was qualified for, I worked as a maid to learn the business from the ground up, Margaret claimed, her perfect smile never reaching her eyes. Andrew, my husband of 6 months, weakly supported his mother's decision. It's temporary, Emily, he'd say, straightening his Italian silk tie. Mother knows best when it comes to the hotel business. I loved Andrew, but his spine had been replaced with jelly years ago when it came to Margaret. That particular morning started like any other. I was changing linens in the presidential suite when Margaret burst in with her entourage of executives. They were showing potential investors around, and I became invisible, just another servant in their world. The Fairmont Grand represents old money elegance, Margaret was saying, gesturing grandly. We maintain certain standards that other hotels have abandoned. Our guests expect proper breeding in every aspect of service. I kept my head down, efficiently tucking hospital corners just like my grandmother had taught me. Grandma Rose had run our family's small country inn for 40 years. Hospitality isn't about fancy labels, she always said. It's about making people feel at home. I missed her fiercely in moments like these. Oh, Margaret's voice dripped with disdain, finally acknowledging my presence. This is my daughter-in-law. Emily dear, please demonstrate for our guests how we fold the towels. Show them what you learn on the farm. The investors chuckled politely. I straightened up, meeting Margaret's eyes as I perfectly executed the hotel's signature lotus fold. One I'd actually created during my internship at the Four Seasons. Adequate, Margaret sniffed, though a bit rustic in technique. That evening, Margaret called a family meeting. The Sterlings gathered in her private office on the top floor. Andrew, his sister Victoria, his father George, who mostly stayed quiet and drank scotch, and me. I've made a decision, Margaret announced, sitting behind her massive mahogany desk. About Emily's position here. My heart lifted slightly, maybe finally. She clearly needs more basic training, Margaret continued. Starting tomorrow, she'll be transferred to laundry services. Perhaps sorting linens will help her understand quality. Victoria snickered. Andrew studied his shoes. I have a master's degree in hospitality management, I said quietly. I graduated top of my class. Dear, Margaret's smile was arctic. Degrees are for people who can't inherit properly. Now, about the charity gala next week, Victoria, you'll be coordinating with the planners. Actually, a new voice interrupted. I believe Emily will be handling that. We all turned to see an elderly man in an impeccable suit standing in the doorway. He carried a leather briefcase that looked older than me. Harold? Margaret's perfectly sculpted eyebrows drew together. What are you doing here? The quarterly legal review isn't until next month. Harold Jenkins, the hotel's longtime lawyer, walked in like he owned the place. I'm here about Rose Montgomery's estate. My heart stopped. My grandmother. Yes, Harold nodded. I was her lawyer too, you see. Have been for 40 years. Interesting woman, your grandmother. Very strategic. Margaret waved a manicured hand dismissively. I fail to see what some country inn proprietor has to do with everything. Harold interrupted, opening his briefcase. You see, 30 years ago, Rose Montgomery purchased a significant number of shares in Sterling Hotels through a holding company called Homestead Hospitality. The room went very, very quiet. That's impossible, Margaret whispered. The only major shareholders heir. Listed through shell companies and holding firms, yes, Harold nodded. Your father-in-law was quite clever that way. needed capital during the expansion in the 90s, sold shares to various investors, including Rose Montgomery. He laid a stack of documents on Margaret's desk. With her passing last month, those shares transferred to her sole heir, along with some other interesting documents regarding the original ownership of the Fairmont Grand itself. My hands started shaking. Grandma Rose had never said a word. What original ownership? Margaret snapped, rifling through the papers. Harold's smile reminded me of a shark. It seems the Fairmont Grand wasn't actually inherited by your family, Margaret. It was purchased from the Montgomery family, with certain conditions in the contract about future ownership stakes. No, Margaret breathed, face growing pale as she read. Yes, Harold continued. And now, with Rose's shares transferring to Emily, combined with those conditional clauses, well, let's just say there's going to be some changes in management structure. The room erupted in chaos. Victoria started shouting about family legacy. George poured another scotch. Andrew actually looked up from his shoes. But I sat quietly, remembering all the times Grandma Rose had asked about my life at the Fairmont Grand. All the times she'd listened to Margaret's cruelty with that knowing gleam in her eye. Sometimes she told me just before she died, you have to let people underestimate you long enough for them to show their true colors. Then you can decide if they deserve to be part of your success. I picked up one of the documents, reading the share percentages, and I smiled. Harold, I said calmly, I believe we need to call an emergency board meeting. First thing tomorrow. No, Margaret stood up, her designer suit crackling with tension. I forbid it. This is my hotel. My company. Actually, I stood too, feeling Grandma Rose's strength flowing through me. I believe you'll find it's mine. And things are about to change around here. Margaret's face turned an interesting shade of purple. Andrew, are you going to let her do this to our family? But Andrew was still staring at the documents, particularly the ones showing how his mother had been systematically diluting his own shares for years. I think, he said slowly, we should all get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a busy day. I walked out of that office with my head high, Harold falling into step beside me. Your grandmother, he said quietly, was very proud of you. She said you had the perfect combination of kindness and steel in your spine. Said you make this place feel like home again. Home. Yes, that's exactly what the Fairmont Grand needed. I took the service elevator down to the laundry room, my last trip as a maid. There was work to be done, and tomorrow would be a very interesting day indeed. I arrived at the Fairmont Grand early the next morning, before the sun had fully risen over Boston's skyline. The night manager did a double take when I walked through the grand lobby in a tailored suit instead of my maid's uniform. Good morning, James, I said warmly. He'd always been kind to me, sneaking me coffee during my long shifts. Could you please make sure the Jefferson boardroom is ready? We're having an emergency meeting at 8. Of course, Miss Sterling, he stammered, then caught himself. I mean Mrs. Montgomery Sterling. I smiled. Emily is fine. We're all family here. The board members started arriving at 7:45. Most I recognized from my days cleaning their offices, though they'd never noticed me. Margaret swept in at 7:59, wearing what I recognized as her battle armor, a blood-red channel suit and pearls the size of marbles. This is ridiculous, she announced to the room. My daughter-in-law is having some sort of mental break. Clearly the pressure of hotel life has been too much for her. Rural sensibilities. Harold cleared his throat. Actually, Mrs. Sterling, if you'll take your seat, we have some rather important business to discuss. The next hour was a masterclass in legal precision. Harold methodically laid out the ownership structure of Sterling Hotels, revealing how my grandmother had quietly accumulated shares over 3 decades. Combined with the original sale contract's conditions, I now controlled 51% of the company. Impossible. Margaret slammed her hand on the mahogany table. That farm woman couldn't have afforded. That farm woman, I interrupted quietly, turned a struggling country inn into the highest-rated boutique hotel in New England. She put herself through business school at night while raising 2 kids alone. And she taught me everything she knew about real hospitality. I stood up, placing my own stack of papers on the table. Now let's discuss the company's performance over the last 5 years. Our occupancy rates have dropped 15%. Customer satisfaction scores are at an all-time low. Staff turnover is triple the industry standard. The board members shifted uncomfortably. They knew the numbers were bad. You've been so focused on appearance, I continued, that you've forgotten what hospitality really means. It's not about Egyptian cotton or designer uniforms. It's about making people feel welcome, guests and employees alike. I outlined my plan: improved staff benefits, investment in training, a complete overhaul of our corporate culture. We're going to make the Fairmont Grand feel like home again, for everyone. This is absurd, Margaret spat. Andrew, say something. Andrew had been unusually quiet until then. He stood slowly, straightening his tie. Actually, Mother, I've been looking at Emily's proposals. They make sense. Our best reviews consistently mention our staff's warmth and dedication when they stick around long enough to build relationships with guests. Margaret's face went from red to white. Traitor, she hissed. No, Andrew's voice was firm. I'm finally being loyal to the right things. Emily's right. We've lost our way. The vote was quick and decisive. I was confirmed as CEO with Andrew as COO. Margaret was offered a position as honorary chairwoman, a title with no actual power. You'll regret this, she snarled, gathering her things. This company will collapse under your farmhand management. I watched her storm out, then turned to the board. Now let's talk about our employees. The next 6 months were intense. I worked harder than ever, but this time on my own terms. We raised wages, introduced profit sharing, and created an education assistance program. Every executive, including me, spent time working alongside housekeeping, maintenance, and kitchen staff. Slowly, things began to change. Employee turnover dropped. Guest satisfaction scores rose. Our restaurants began winning awards again. Margaret, meanwhile, launched a smear campaign telling anyone who would listen that I was destroying her family's legacy. But the numbers spoke for themselves. By the end of the first year, profits were up 20%, and we've been voted best place to work in hospitality by 3 different publications. The real test came during the holiday season. The Fairmont Grand's Christmas Eve party was legendary in Boston society circles. This year, I made some changes. Instead of the usual celebrity chef, our own kitchen staff designed the menu, showcasing their diverse talents. Instead of hired carolers, we had an employee choir. And instead of restricting staff to working, we invited them to bring their families. The grand ballroom buzzed with genuine joy. Housekeepers danced with hedge fund managers. Line cooks shared recipes with socialites. Children of executives played with children of bellhops. That's when Margaret made her final stand. She burst in wearing last year's designer dress, clearly tipsy. Look what she's done, she announced to the crowd. Turned our sophisticated establishment into a common workers' holiday party. The room fell silent. I started to speak, but Andrew beat me to it. Mother, he said clearly, look around. Everyone is happy. The hotel is thriving. Emily hasn't destroyed our legacy, she's made it better. By turning it into a charity house, Margaret sneered. No, came a deep voice. By turning it back into what it was always meant to be. Harold stepped forward, holding an old photograph. In it, a much younger Margaret stood with her father-in-law, Andrew's grandfather, in front of the hotel. Your father-in-law, Harold said quietly, started as a bellhop here when it was owned by the Montgomerys. Rose's father gave him a chance, promoted him, mentored him. That's why he made sure Rose could buy shares later, to honor that legacy of opportunity. Margaret stared at the photo, something crumbling in her perfect facade. You've forgotten, I said gently, that true luxury isn't about excluding people. It's about making everyone feel special. She left quietly after that. Last I heard, she'd moved to Palm Beach. A year later, we opened our first new property, the Rose Montgomery Inn at the Fairmont Grand, a boutique hotel within a hotel, offering the warm, personal service my grandmother was famous for at luxury scale. The original inn back home. We kept it exactly as it was, down to the handmade quilts on every bed. I still go there sometimes to remind myself where I came from. Andrew and I are stronger than ever. Turns out he has a spine of steel when he's not being manipulated. He runs operations while I handle strategy, and we make a great team. Last week, I made my final peace offering to Margaret. I offered her a job, not as a figurehead, but as a genuine employee. Start in housekeeping, I suggested. Learn the business from the ground up, like you once made me do. She didn't accept, of course. But her silence was better than her previous attacks. Yesterday, I found a young woman crying in the staff room. She'd been berated by a wealthy guest and was sure she'd be fired. "Come with me," I said, helping her up. I took her to my office, still the same one Margaret once ruled from. But now the walls hold different photos. Staff celebrations, guest thank you notes, the original inn where I grew up. "Let me tell you a story," I said, "about my grandmother and what she taught me about hospitality. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about making things better than they ever were before." And somewhere I know Grandma Rose is smiling.